done that at all. So here we go. And Michael Wilcock is the lead social scientist in the World Bank's Development Research Group and part-time lecturer in public policy at the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University. That's all he sent me. But I found out that he also has an MA and PhD in sociology from Brown. He taught previously at Harvard University from the Kennedy School from 2000 to 2006. From 2006 to 2009, he was the founding research director of the Brooks World Poverty Institute at the University of Manchester, where he was professor of social science and development policy. And today he's going to talk about how 7 boring household objects change the world. And thankfully, the computer is not one of them.
All right.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Changed it.
I did. I've got. You're a special audience, so you get an extra bonus boring object. Good afternoon. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for coming along to hear me. We need to turn this on, perhaps.
Lift up the speaker.
No, do I swallow it? Is that better?
Yeah, let's just turn it up a tiny bit.
Turn it up a tiny bit. How do we do that? That's about as long as it can go.
I know. So we're gonna go ahead.
Then I'll eat it.
Yes. Yeah.
I'll treat it like an ice cream. How does that go?
That's how we do it.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here. I know for some of you, you've attended a funeral today, and I hope this can in some way provide a different type of input into your day. Thank you so much for coming along. As you probably could tell from my accent already, I'm not from here. I'm not even from the United States. I'm not from England, which is probably where you think I come from. I actually come from Australia. I've lived here in the United States for 28 years now, which is the time when I came for graduate school, and then subsequently working mostly at the World Bank in Washington, but also in various other places which you heard about. I'm going to talk about these 8 things that seemingly boring, but actually very consequential things that change the world. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about the World Bank, since that's who pays my bills or pays our household bills. It's great to have my wife here today, because I can only do what I do because she does what she does. And that's a very important part of what makes it possible for me even to be here. But I'm going to talk about the World Bank and just give you a very brief sort of sense of where it comes from, or where it came from 75 years ago, this month, literally. And then just move into a discussion about these things that we take for granted in our lives that were once great novelties. Perhaps in your own lifetime they were a novelty. But they have fundamentally changed our lives. They make it possible for us to live the kinds of lives that we live. But for most people in the world today, those things can't be taken for granted. They are still to be introduced, they are still to be experienced, and the effects of them are still to be experienced. And so I'm going to talk about those. But as I said, I'm going to open with this discussion about the World Bank. That's a picture of the World Bank. It's 2 blocks from the White House in Washington, D.C. You all know that the address of the White House is 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The World Bank is at 1800 Pennsylvania Avenue. So just 2 blocks up the road. And across the street, you can't see it in the photo, is its sister organization called the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. And those organizations are collectively known as the Bretton Woods institutions because they were founded in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in the midst of the Second World War, 75 years ago. And they were conceived and birthed with this goal of trying to ensure that the awful calamities that had occurred in the 1930s and that had done so much to precipitate the Second World War would not happen again, that we could somehow construct an organizational architecture that could anticipate and respond to these big economic and political challenges in ways that were much more effective than just not having them at all or trying to solve them on a case-by-case basis. So the division of labor, as it were, between these 2 different organizations was that the International Monetary Fund would largely deal with major macro financial crises and was kind of like the doctor, or even the emergency room doctor. When a country would have a major crisis, it would be the International Monetary Fund that would turn up to try and help that particular country sort its finances out. And so even today, a country like Greece, even though it's a rich country, it has recently received assistance from the International Monetary Fund. But more traditionally, or more frequently, I should say, it's countries like Argentina, which has just had another major recent financial crisis, or the very poorest countries in the world that have these kinds of crises quite frequently. The world, of course, experienced a major global financial crisis 12 years or so ago. And again, that was one of the tasks of the International Monetary Fund, was to try and help countries to navigate those kinds of waters. So most of what the IMF is doing is at a very large macro scale, and it's trying to deal with crises when they've actually happened. The World Bank, on the other hand, tries to do all the things that prevent those crises from happening in the first place. It's kind of like a public health specialist rather than an emergency room doctor. It tries to ensure that good things are baked into the way in which we live our life so that we don't have to have crises at all. But of course, it takes a long time for a country to build out its administrative and its political infrastructure and its economic infrastructure to ensure that those kinds of things don't happen very frequently. So most of the World Bank's work is concerned with trying to build roads, trying to build schools and hospitals, trying to help reform the public sector, or in some cases even build a public sector from scratch. So we're doing all this work that takes a long time for the benefits to appear. It's really trying to help a country get its entire society across the different levels of development such that they can enjoy a more prosperous life, so that its citizens can enjoy a more prosperous life. Some of you might have noticed this week that one of my colleagues at Harvard and two of my other more distant colleagues at MIT have just won the Nobel Prize for their work on poverty reduction. Their kind of work is much more focused on very specific interventions targeted at very specific people. Some of you, for example, might have participated in a child sponsorship program where you try and give money every month to a child in a distant country, and you give that money in the hope that that child will be able to go to school. Right? So that's an example of a very targeted intervention to a very specific group of people in a very specific place. And that's the kind of work that has been recognized with this week's Nobel Prize. That's kind of different from the work that the World Bank does, which is trying to change the whole society, really, by building out its infrastructure and its ports and its taxation system and all these things that I think are fundamentally important to a society. But when you live in a rich country like the United States or Australia, you tend to take these things for granted. So the rest of my talk really is going to be focusing on some of these boring things that are what the World Bank actually does, but which we here in rich countries often don't fully appreciate. So that's the basic distinction between what the International Monetary Fund does and what the World Bank does. The World Bank itself has 5 different member organizations, and they're on the screen. I won't go through all of those. So it's actually, technically, it's called the World Bank Group. The largest part of that is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So it does a lot of work historically and still today trying to rebuild societies after they've gone through a war, for example. When it gives those, it usually gives a combination of loans or technical assistance to those countries and the support they're trying to solicit in order to improve their situation. But other countries are the very poorest countries, usually about 35 countries at the bottom end of the world's distribution of wealth. Those countries can't afford to take loans, so they receive grants instead. They receive money that they don't have to pay back. And that happens through the second little bullet point there, called the International Development Association, IDA, as we call it. And so IDA countries, the very poorest countries, the most war-torn places, they receive grants. Well, the other, about 100 or so other countries are mostly receiving loans or technical assistance of one kind or another in order to advance their own development agenda. And my particular work is in the research department of the World Bank. So the reason I have these sort of affiliate associations on the side, as it were, by teaching it at the Kennedy School, is because I work in the research department of the World Bank, which is kind of like a think tank built into the World Bank. And we have a very academic life. We are publishing journal articles and writing books, but we're ultimately trying to contribute to the storehouse of knowledge and evidence on which much of the policy advice and the programmatic advice that we give to countries rests. So that's a large part of what I do. Literally right now, I am co-directing a major report for the World Bank on global poverty. The world has set as a target a goal of getting extreme poverty. And by that we mean people living on about $2 a day, which is very, very small sums of money. But we're trying to get the level of extreme poverty in the world down to 3% by 2030, so over the next 11 years or so. And I'm going to be working with a team of people to try and not just assess the extent to which we might achieve that goal, but trying to explain more about why some countries will achieve that goal and why some will not, and then trying to offer a different set of approaches to thinking about how we might engage those particular countries that look like they're struggling. Some countries just in recent years have done extraordinarily well. Countries like China might be well known to you, but other countries perhaps less so, like Vietnam. They've had probably the fastest poverty reduction ever recorded in human history, which is just extraordinary given that you know far better than I just where Vietnam was only 45 or so years ago. So it is possible for countries to undergo these major transformations and to go from being very poor to being much less poor, being in the middle income countries, as we call them, over the course of a generation or two. And we're hopeful that many countries in Africa will soon be able to say that as well. So that's sort of a very broad introduction and a quick introduction to the World Bank and to the International Monetary Fund. They have lots of power in the world that some people are very critical of, but a large part of the reason they have that power is because they are very influential in shaping the credit ratings that particular countries have. So if you're taking a loan from the World Bank, it probably means you couldn't get a loan from anybody else. And so if you don't pay your loans back to the World Bank, that can send very unhappy signals to the rest of the world about the state of your economy. So a lot of these countries will do everything they can to try and make sure they pay back their loans, but those then can be conceived in certain quarters as being very onerous or something that is making great demands on a society. But for those countries that are receiving grants, of course, that particular obligation isn't there. Anyway, these are these major international organizations created to try and anticipate and respond to and prevent the kinds of financial crises that used to be very common, and we certainly haven't eliminated them, but they happen less frequently, and more countries are moving in the direction of having fewer poor people and having fewer financial crises, in large part because of this big multilateral set of institutions that exist precisely to try and prevent those kinds of challenges. But it's very hard oftentimes to prove that is true. A lot of times when we don't get sick, we don't appreciate that in a different time of history we may well have been sick much more than we are, and so we take for granted that we are well. I think the same thing often happens with the United Nations or with other, with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund too. The fact that awful things don't happen with the frequency with which they used to happen means that we see this as the new normal. We take it for granted. When I think historical sensibility about these kinds of issues should make us more appreciative of the fact that so much of these things used to be quite common occurrences, and they were things that we didn't have the tools or the institutions available to help us deal with. But now we do, sort of. And I think also need to be thinking much more about how we engage with these types of problems in the 21st century, given that many of these institutions that we now have, or that I work for, were designed at a different time in history, perhaps with a different set of political realities that confronted them. But if you'd like to talk a bit more about that, I can do so afterwards. You're mostly here to hear about the boring things that change the world, so let's talk about those. I like these lists because everybody's got their own lists. Someone's already suggested to me that the clothes peg should be on the list. Unfortunately, it's not. If I was to ask you over a cup of tea or coffee, I'm sure you'd have some other things that you would nominate, and we can maybe do that over dinner. I'm going to give you my list because in my experience at least, and in my understanding of how the development process works, these are the big things that have fundamentally changed the world. So, the big 8. I had a bit longer today, so I'm going to give you 8 rather than 7. There are 2 in the bathroom, 2 in the kitchen, 2 in your backyard, or actually 2, 1 in the front yard, and 2 in the filing cabinet. So even where they're located is pretty boring, okay? What's not on the list? You might think that I'm going to talk about the wonders of the internet or how computers and mobile phones and cell phones, etc., have changed things, but most of the rich countries were rich long before any of those kinds of things came along. The kinds of living standards that the United States was enjoying in the 1920s and 1930s is still vastly beyond what many countries that are very poor, like Niger and Mali, enjoy today. So you don't get rich just by having lots of computers. You don't get rich by having lots of cell phones. That didn't fundamentally change things all that much. If I had even longer to go out to items number 9, 10, 11, and 12, I could talk about the roof, about how fundamental roofs are to people's lives. When the very poorest people get a little bit richer, well, the first thing they do with their money, well, the first thing they do is eat more, but because they're often very hungry. But the next thing they do is invest in the roof of their house. So corrugated iron is super boring, but most people are able to enjoy a dry night of sleep because of the corrugated iron sheets that were invented roughly 100 years ago. The combustion engine, financial statements, credit cards, all these things are kind of boring now, but they really did fundamentally change the world. But I'm not going to talk about those. I'm going to talk about this thing first of all. I'm going to talk about the toilet. If you've traveled around the world, you've had the benefit, I hope, of experience all sorts of ways in which you get to do your bodily functioning. But a poll that was taken of public health officials about 10 years or so ago, asking them, over the last 200 years, what has been the single biggest thing that has changed the incidence of contagious diseases and of all of the things that used to kill babies when they were very young and kill adults even when they were very young, and that still affect many adults in developing countries today. And it was their answer was the development of public sanitation systems, and the entry point into the sanitation system for most of us, of course, is through the toilet. It's the first thing we do when we wake up in the morning. We do our business, we push a little button and it magically disappears. And it's completely oblivious to us that that is just an absolute wonder. The fact that clean water comes into our house, that swishes around inside the toilet bowl and makes this stuff disappear, that if it was left there or for most of history was just tossed out of the window onto some unfortunate passerby. Literally, that's what used to happen. That's how diseases spread. That's how all sorts of awful things happened. It was why people died in the tens of thousands because of the fact that we didn't have these effective mechanisms in place for dealing with our bodily waste products. So wherever you go in the world, you'll see different forms of toilets. This is a toilet you might find quite commonly in South Asia, in India and Bangladesh, or in the Middle East, where people squat rather than sit, but everyone's got their own different way of doing it. But the beauty of this otherwise super boring thing is that it keeps all of us alive. And if your toilet, or if all of our toilets were blocked up for a week, the public health crisis that it would unleash in this community or any community would just be truly catastrophic. So we should never ever take our toilets for granted. That's our first thing. The second thing I'm going to talk about is the shower. Why is the shower kind of a big radical change? Well, partly because it does two things. It brings clean water inside of your house because you wouldn't take a shower in dirty water. And you have warm water because you probably wouldn't want to take a shower at this time of year in water that wasn't heated. So the fact that we can wake up after we've gone to the bathroom and then step into the shower, turn on a few knobs and have clean hot water coming out is just, again, a piece of engineering magic that we mostly take for granted. Our personal hygiene, our capacity then to have hot water for all sorts of other purposes is all made possible, or at least embodied in, this wonderful thing called the shower. One of my good close friends and colleagues says that that's his standard for when we can claim that poverty has been reduced, when everybody in the world can have a hot shower in the morning. That's and I don't know what the exact number is of people who can't claim that. I would guess it's probably around 2 billion people out of the 7.5 billion in the world right now. But a heck of a lot of people just cannot take for granted that the water they drink is clean, that the water they put on their body is clean, or that they can just routinely have water that's hot and able to be used for not only their own personal hygiene, but for cooking, for cleaning, for doing all the things that we need water for in our lives. Many women and children walk for hours and hours every day just to get one little pot of water to be able to boil their rice or to be able to wash their clothes. Even then, they might only do that once a week or so. So the provision of water is just such a very basic thing. Our bodies are 70% water. We are water. We need lots of it to keep ourselves going. And it's one of the true wonders of the modern world that everywhere we go, we have access to clean water and to hot water. And if we didn't have those things, we would be much, much worse off as a result. So that's inside your bathroom. Your toilet and your shower are two wonders of simple inventions that are actually truly transformative in terms of changing how people live. And how does that map back onto the work of the World Bank? Well, we have big programs built around trying to enhance the quality of sanitation systems. If you've been to a slum in a developing country, you'll just know the awful smell that characterizes all of that because there is no sanitation, because people have to do their daily business, but the systems haven't been put in place to be able to deal with all of those things. And so it costs millions and millions of dollars to be able to build out an effective sanitation system in these really crowded places, or to be able to build sanitation systems in isolated and rural areas as well. But those are just so fundamental to improving the welfare of people and getting clean water and energy to people to be able to enable that clean water to be heated follows close behind. That means electricity. That means a whole bunch of alternative energy sources other than just firewood or animal dung or all the usual things that people would otherwise have to use in order to be able to get adequate energy to be able to fuel their lives. Okay, out of the bathroom into the kitchen. I'm going to talk about the oven. And I'm going to talk about the first oven, the very first place in human history where humans decided to build something. Most of us, of course, associate our ovens now with gas and electricity, the modern oven. But I'm going to talk just quickly about why I think the oven that preceded it was actually vastly more consequential than the oven that we now take for and have in our houses. The first thing is that the original hearth, the original center of communal life for most of human history was built around, of course, a fireplace of some kind. But it was an enormously consequential invention when humans tamed fire. When humans figured out roughly about 80,000 years ago how to turn this extraordinary power, this power to burn things, the power to destroy things, which they only associated with lightning strikes or with maybe volcanic eruptions or with sort of chance incidences of where sparks might fly, to be able to figure out how to actually create a fire seemingly from nothing, and then to not let that fire get out of control, to be able to use it to keep warm, to be able to cook food. All of those things had hugely consequential impacts on human settlements, where humans would live, how far north they could go into the colder lands when they knew that they could bring their own heat system with them. It's why humans are to be found in more diverse places on the planet than every other creature, maybe except for cockroaches or something. But there's two other really interesting things about fire as well. Because the family tends to gather around a common pot, to gather around the hearth, to gather to eat a meal together, this is in fact the universal definition of a household. Now that might not sound that big of a deal, but when you're doing household surveys, or when you're doing research in all countries of the world to try and ascertain what a household's income is, for example, it seems clear at one level that we would have an unambiguous understanding or definition of what a household is. But it, of course, turns out to be vastly more complicated than that when you have all sorts of relatives living with you, or other extended family members that might be living under your roof. What exactly is the household? Well, the universal definition of a household is the group that shares a common hearth, a common oven, a common cooking source. And that was the very first thing that humans did when they were able to tame fire, was to use it for cooking. But that has now been formalized as the definition of a household. If people are a household to the extent they share this common oven. The other really interesting thing was that humans completely changed their entire bodies once they could cook food. Again, one of those things that is just a longer historical thing that happened hundreds, tens of thousands of years before any of us were around. But one of the defining features of humans is that we have very big brains and very small stomachs. We compared to a cow, for example, or a sheep, who have multiple stomachs, right? It takes an awful lot of energy and effort to be able to digest food when you can't cook it. But humans have shrunk their digestive systems down to these tiny little things compared to literally every other creature, because we are able to cook food. We can do most of our digestion in the pot itself, rather than having to do that, rather than have to do it inside our body. It also means that we can be omnivorous. We can eat meat, we can eat plants, we can eat all sorts of things that other creatures can't. Most other creatures have very narrow diets, or even rodents like rats, which can eat anything. Most of their body is a digestive system, because they have to be able to process all this extraordinary array of food that they eat internally. Humans don't have to do that. We've saved space on our intestines and freed up space to have bigger brains so that we can do all sorts of other creative things. So the oven is really, really important, because it embodies not only this household, it embodies the taming of this superpower called fire, and it has fundamentally changed even the very physique that humans occupy. So again, next time you even light a candle, recognize that you have tamed fire. Out of control, as you know, that little candle can fall on the floor, can hit a newspaper, can then burn a whole house down within half an hour. So it's an extraordinary power. And humans recognized this right from the get-go, but figured out if they could constrain the fire, if they could keep the fire within limits, it could do extraordinary things. And it turns out not only to have kept them warm, not only to have defined their households, but to indeed shape their entire body. The next thing is the refrigerator. Coming a bit further forward, perhaps some of you can remember the first time your household got hold of a refrigerator for the first time. It's kind of the opposite of the fire, right? We've tamed fire. We knew how to we figured out a long time ago how to create heat and how to use heat. But at the opposite end of the temperature spectrum is keeping things cool and enabling humans to not just live in cold climates, but to be able to live in warm climates. Is largely what the refrigerator has done. It's why states like Arizona, which in your lifetime has gone from being having very few people living in it to being able to be one of the fastest growing states, largely because of air conditioning, largely because of refrigeration, which enables humans not only to keep their body within an acceptable temperature range, but enables medicines to be shipped all over the world, enables flowers to be moved all over the world. Most of the florists' flowers that you buy here come from Africa or from Latin America or from Holland, all shipped around the world inside these amazing containers that are able to exploit refrigeration. We can get really low-cost drugs to poor people in rural areas of Africa, largely because now of refrigeration, which enables these things to be kept cool so that they can be transported very cheaply over long distances. It's also meant that you don't have to go shopping every day. Most people for most of history were living a hand-to-mouth existence because they couldn't store their food. They could only eat things that were fresh and available to them. But if they needed to have things kept for longer periods of time, the perishable foods, then they had to only keep buying those on a day-to-day basis. Now we get all the benefits of economies of scale, as it's called, of being able to shop at Costco and all the rest, because we all have these refrigeration systems, which enabled us to be able to exploit the fact that we can buy much more but less frequently. So we have to travel less to do our shopping. Some might lament that that means we no longer have the nice little family store in our village where we could go and meet people on a day-to-day basis. But in principle, the food revolution that means that more people can actually eat 3 meals a day than at any other time in history is largely a function of the advances of refrigeration, which enable us to store food and to be able to transport it to other people without the risk that that food is going to perish. So this most basic thing that keeps us alive, our food, and the food distribution systems across the world that manifest itself in supermarkets, all of that ultimately is made possible largely because of refrigeration. So at opposite ends of the temperature spectrum, taming fire and channeling and sustaining coolness, all those things have just been so fundamental to enabling our world to be the one that it is. The next thing, you probably wouldn't think that your fence was actually that big of a deal. And not just in the Robert Frost sense that good fences make good neighbours and all that sort of thing, but in a very real sense, that this is an invention, an innovation that looks extremely boring because it's only a piece of paper that maybe is in your filing cabinet. But it signifies that you are the legal owner of a particular asset. In this particular case, it's your house and your land that it sits on, but it could also be your car, it could also be the bonds and stocks that you own. It's the assigning of this abstraction called a piece of property right to an asset that you own and that you can then trade has been hugely significant for being able to protect what is yours, but also to be able to exchange and to sell what you have in exchange for something that someone else has that you might like to have instead. So the whole system of exchange fundamentally rests on being able to have these very strange agreements that we have upheld in law that enable us to leverage our assets and to be able to use them for getting mortgages and credit of one kind or another. All of that depends on us being able to have security over this particular resource that we have. I should stress, though, that this is a very modern and a very Western idea, that the land in particular can be bought and sold. And one of the great challenges that the settlers of New England faced when they first came here 400 years ago and were negotiating with the native settlers of this area and indeed throughout the rest of the country was that the original inhabitants of this land didn't have that conception of what land itself was. They didn't believe that land was owned by anybody, and they didn't believe that you should or could buy and sell land in the way that you could buy and sell apples. Because it was sacred. It was where their ancestors resided. It was where the gods lived. And so this turning of all of that abstraction into something that could be bought and sold has been and continues to be an enormously contested aspect of the whole development process. Our teams have done work with nomadic populations in northern Kenya, for example. If you're a nomadic population, by definition, you don't live anywhere. You don't have a house. You don't have a piece of land that you can call your own. But large part of what has made modern capitalism possible and what has made our lives possible is the security and the longevity of the right to have access to and claim ownership of our assets, our material assets, whether it be our land or other assets that we own, like our cars that I mentioned as well. We can also leverage our education. We can also do all sorts of things by being able to show that they are assets on which a return can be expected. And the creation of these systems to be able to build out that array of financing instruments associated with that is what really then launched so much of our financial and credit arrangements around the world. But the humble fence I am putting here on the screen just because it embodies the fact that this is mine, this is not yours, and here is the line where that happens. And I have a piece of paper that says this is mine, and you believe that this is mine because it's written on a piece of paper. That's a magical act, the fact that we would agree that that was true. Most people for most of history kill each other when they disagree over those kinds of things. Civilized people don't do that because we have an agreed understanding that these things called property rights exist, are real, and that they can be and should be the basis on which we then conduct a large part of our financial exchanging. Okay, next to the fence, or on your fence perhaps, is the mailbox. That's another super important thing. Why am I talking about the humble mailbox? For two reasons. Because it embodies our communication with each other, whether it's not just the junk mail that you get from all sorts of companies that you probably don't want to hear from, but for still today, whether you're collecting things from Amazon or whether you're getting letters from relatives elsewhere, all of that happens through the wonder of the mail system. And I'm just going to quote on this slide on the right here. This is from the National Postal Museum in Washington, D.C. I'm going to bet I'm lucky if 3 people in this entire room have ever gone to the National Postal Museum. 1, 2, come on, I said 3. There's got to be a third person. It's a really cool museum to go to, the National Postal Museum. Why is it so interesting? Because there used to be, every state used to have its own postal system. And as you can imagine, when you were trying to send something from Alabama to New Hampshire 100 years ago, when those were entirely different postal systems, things would get lost. It would be unclear. There were no post codes. There were no addresses as such on streets. All sorts of things had to happen in order for land to become mappable and then legible to a bureaucratic system. So that's why we all have addresses. Even when you're here at Newbury Court, there's an address. It's a place. It's real. Mail can get sent to you because this particular place exists in a larger universe of being able to exchange communication in one form or another. And so you might think that that's the boring sort of task that communications does through the post office. But if you go to the National Post Office Museum in Washington, this is what it says at the entrance when you walk in. The people who work for the National Postal Museum are messengers of sympathy and love, servants of parted friends, consoler of the lonely, bond of the scattered family, enlarger of the common life. So the humble person you meet in a post office when you're going to buy stamps, are they just kind of just selling you stamps and a few envelopes? No, they are messengers of sympathy and love. They are servants of parted friends. They're doing this much more exalted work. And it's really important that people understand that that's what they're doing, because without those systems of interaction, without being able to communicate with each other in this way and be able to do this seamlessly, boringly, at scale for everybody, we just wouldn't have those ways of being able to interact with each other. And your humble mailbox with its number and its capacity to receive these boxes or parcels or envelopes from all over the world is another just seemingly very boring but very fundamental thing that makes it possible for the rest of the world to communicate with you and for you to communicate with the rest of the world. Number 7. This is in your filing cabinet, right? Your birth certificate. This is super duper boring. Maybe you've haven't even seen that in a while. But your birth certificate is you. It proves that you exist. And if you haven't got one of those things, for all intents and purposes, you do not exist. You will not be able to do anything in life unless you have that particular piece of paper. And that is true still for at least over 1 billion people in the world still today. They are born in a village in a rural area of a developing country. There is no system for recording that birth. There is no way in which that event happened as far as an administrative system of one kind or another is concerned. And yet it's so basic to being able to get now a driver's license, a social security number, a bank account. All of those things depend on you being you and being able to prove that you are you, and to being able to call upon that when people challenge. In fact, where were you born? Are you in fact a citizen of this country? Right? So I'm not a citizen of this country, but I have a birth certificate, and it's kind of a quirky blue one that I got from the hospital in Melbourne, Australia, where I was born. But that travels with me everywhere because it proves that I am who I say I am. And it then gives rise to my passport, to my driver's license, to all the other crucial documents that enable me to access getting through borders between countries, being able to be eligible to drive a car. All of that ultimately depends on me being able to prove who I am and you being able to prove who you are. And we, again, just take that for granted. We assume that everybody can prove who they are. But most people, for most of history, have not been able to do that. And thus, they can be sold and bought like property. Thus, they can be exploited. Thus, they have no rights. The whole extension of human rights, the whole concept of human rights depends on people being able to prove who they are. And it's one of the least accomplished and seemingly boring campaigns in the world right now is to just try and give birth certificates to every child that's born, right? There is no glamour in that. Is the least sexy thing you can do is to hand out a piece of paper to a kid when they're a baby when they're born, or hope that their mother, who may well be illiterate, is somehow going to know what to do with this particular piece of paper. That piece of paper will make all the difference in that child's life subsequently, because they will be able to prove who they are. And everything else that we enjoy in the modern world depends on ultimately a signature, a contract, all those other things that I've talked about depend on you being able to prove who you are. So that is another super boring, super important thing that influences our well-being in life. The last thing I'm going to talk about is insurance policies. Another super boring thing that, again, is that I talked before about the taming of fire, and that candles and the hearth were an example of the way in which fire has been tamed. Well, what's been tamed by insurance is risk, is bad stuff happening to us, which happens all the time, but needn't or often isn't calamitous because of the fact that we have a mechanism, this wonderful invention called insurance, that spreads out that risk over time and over across space, such that when awful things happen, like a tornado or a flood in some parts of this country, federal insurance ensures that the 99.9% of the rest of the country that isn't experiencing that calamity is able to help those unfortunate people that are suffering from that. On the understanding that over time, these kinds of bad things might eventually happen elsewhere, and in turn, those risks will then be able to be addressed in other places at other times. That's how risk management works. That's how health insurance works. And pretty much everything in the modern world is insured. Your life is insured, I hope. We have health insurance, I hope. Your car is insured. Your house is insured. This town is insured. Concord, Massachusetts itself is insured against bad things happening. The state of Massachusetts is insured. Your bank is insured. These are all things that happen behind the scenes, but that ensure that there aren't bank runs, for example, right? There's all the It's a Wonderful Life and all the movies that we love watching are all often characterized by these awful events called bank runs, where people would rush to the bank to get all their money out, right? That doesn't happen anymore. Why? Because of insurance systems. The FDIC that exists to ensure that if financial disaster strikes, that the government will be there in this case to be able to ensure that your bank is solvent, that your assets will be sustained, and that you can get hold of them. So these things all happen in the background, where we take for granted that pretty much every aspect of our life is insured by someone somehow, but the purpose of those things is to tame risk, is to stop awful things having calamitous effects. And that is a defining feature of life for most poor countries, is that war and illness and being unable to work, having an injury, all of these things are risks that happen frequently. And they needn't be calamitous. And one of the characteristics of a developing country is that it's created these systems that enable us to be able to not eliminate risk, but to tame it, to be able to harness it, to be able to respond effectively to it when it happens, so that it still is awful, but it doesn't have to wipe us out. It doesn't have to contribute to a spiral of destitution, whereby we're injured, for example, thus we can't work, thus we can't earn income, thus we can't feed our families, thus our families get even more sick, thus they can't work. All these spirals all happen when risk is left unconstrained, when risk is allowed to unfurl and do all the awful things that often are associated with compounding forms of risk. But insurance, like the hearth, is one way to tame these forces and to be able to bring them under some form of control. And that largely is where I want to finish, is by being able to say that Whether it's the toilet, whether it's your shower, whether it's your hearth, whether it's your birth certificate or your fence or your post office box or your insurance policy, those are the big things that have fundamentally changed the world. Those are the things that have turned the United States and Australia from being poor countries in the 19th century to being rich countries in the early 20th century and still being rich countries now. It's not so much because the people are smarter, it's because they've built systems that constrain all these awful things from happening. And they enable most of the good things to happen very cheaply and very easily, like hot water, like energy, like being able to prevent awful things from happening, being able to prove who you are, being able to go to a courthouse or to a police station and expect and hope and know that the police officers will take your case seriously and do something about them. All of those are wonders of the modern world that are still to be realized in most countries for most people. And the task of development really is fundamentally about trying to do those things. So if any of that's stimulated you, the fun version of a lot of that can be found in a wonderful book by our friend Bill Bryson, or I'm sure you've read at some of his books at some time. He has this wonderful book called At Home, A Short History of Private Life, where he goes through every room in your house and gives you a little history of, and it's Bill Bryson levels of quirkiness and humor and insight, but a fantastic sort of look at how the house became the house and what it used to be and what it is now and all these different changes that have occurred as a result of it. If you're interested in sort of the slightly more formal version of all of this, about especially America's rise as a over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries from being an outlier country far to the west of where all the real action was happening in Europe to becoming the epicenter of so much of the geopolitics of the world. Much of that fueled by its capacity to do at scale all of those 8 things that I just mentioned. That story is told in this more academic book, but still very readable, called The Rise and Fall of American Growth by Robert Gordon, who's at the University of Chicago, I think, or Northwestern University, one of those places in Chicago. Anyway, on that note, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have, or if we need to eat or do other things or you need to talk, that's fine as well. But thank you for listening to me, and I hope that's been interesting and informative for you. Thank you.
In line with your first item, the bathroom, I've recently discovered that Walmart is probably the biggest place in America that is selling items to most people. Mm-hmm. And what do you suppose their biggest seller is? Toilet paper.
A recent study listed 3 criteria for being able to cope with climate change in our next big change. 2 of them, you already mentioned, energy and water. The 3rd was universal access to the internet. Is this a new item for your list?
I guess I would just say that the internet is the post office on steroids, right? It's taking communication which used to be a week, say, to get a letter from one person to another. Now it can be done in a microsecond because we figured out how to do that even faster, even cheaper than we ever have before. So I see it as a vast improvement of an existing system rather than the invention of the new system. And I guess I give more credence, more sort of brownie points to people that come up with something and invent it from scratch, and then rather than those who fine tune and perfect the existing system. But yes, for all the reasons that I mentioned about managing risk, about being able to communicate quickly and easily, all of that will need to have the internet being available to everyone. But I sort of see the internet as like fire as well, though, right? We have to constrain the internet as much as we need to use it. It's an enormous resource. It can do all sorts of good things, but you don't need me to tell you that the bad guys can use the internet just as well as the good guys. And since my wife and I are parents of 2 teenage kids, we're sort of very conscious of the fact that There are all sorts of terrible ideas and not good people that are promulgating a lot of that, all using the low cost and widely accessible nature of the internet to be able to ensure that those things are available. So for me, the internet's just, the analogy is like fire. We've got to figure out how to constrain it into the hearth, not let it become a bushfire that burns the whole place down. And at the moment, I think because this is the first generation that's really both invented and then experienced the full effects of the internet, we haven't figured out how to regulate it properly yet. We haven't figured out how to constrain this fire. We want to be able to use it for sure. The potential upsides are enormous, but the potential downsides are pretty big too. And if we don't figure out how to constrain that fire, I think it's going to be continuing to do what it's doing a lot with politics in the United States right now, with our whole challenging of truths and all of those big problems pertaining to what counts as fact and what counts as truth are all just being vastly complicated by the fact that anyone and everyone has a view on these things now and can shout it to anybody else in their world and can surround themselves by people that will reinforce that particular set of beliefs. So yes, huge upsides which we have to and must channel, especially for the purposes of moving to a world in which we use less energy, in which we become much more able to work together to be able to solve our problems. But the very essence of being able to work together means that a lot of the less happy things in the world can happen just as quickly as the not so good things. And how we optimize, how we figure out the right balance, and how we figure out how to tame that fire, that's the current generation's task, I think.
When you were talking about the toilet, just recently subscribed to Netflix, and I watched Inside Bill's Brain, Bill Gates and Melinda Gates read an article about how babies were dying from diarrhea, and she said, how is that possible today? So, he set to, like he does, I guess, getting all the best brains to come up with a toilet that could work in these countries without electricity, and it was incredible. But a toilet's very important, I mean.
Yeah.
If anyone hasn't seen it, they have Netflix. It's quite incredible.
Yeah, I mean, we figure that out every time we have a town festival, right? We bring out the porta potties or the whatever you want to call them, like the portable toilets, and they're there because, geez, nobody wants to have to wait for hours to find the one bathroom in the local library or whatever is closest by. So we've invented, in a technical sense, the capacity to be able to do that. So those are good for a temporary basis, or they're okay for people that live in very far-flung areas. But you do actually see some of those kinds of things in some slums that I have been to in India. Just see like 200 of them lined up next to each other in the morning, and people go and do their business, and then someone has the awful job of emptying it every couple of hours. And even I'm old enough to remember going on holidays in Australia to a place that didn't have an internal toilet, it had an outside toilet, and we had to go out and do our business in this little hut in the backyard. And I remember thinking, like, but who's got the job? Who cleans it? And sure enough, some poor hapless person had to show up every few days to collect every single person's excrement from every one of these little things. And so we regard it as progress that doesn't have to be the way things are anymore. But there's a whole other set of complications that go with that. You might think, for example, that everyone would want to have a toilet in their house as a measure of prestige or as a measure of public health. But one of the big behavioral challenges with introducing toilets into rural India, for example, is that in very strongly Hindu communities, there is a particular passage in their sacred text that written in a very different era. But when this particular text is very clear that you should not have a urinal, you should not have a bathroom within close proximity to a sacred text, because they will pollute each other, right? If your Bible, if it was Christian, but the Bhagavad Gita, their sacred text, that is not allowed to be in close proximity to their their toilet. So if they're a poor family and they're living in one room, because they are very pious and very observant members of their religious community, they would rather give up the toilet than give up their sacred text. Right? So they're trying to change that behavior. It isn't just a matter of showing up as the savior who's going to provide the toilet and watch them greet you with glee and gratitude. Oftentimes they might go, yeah, maybe I actually don't want this. It's going to violate my religious principles to be able to have this toilet thing inside my house, and I'd rather not do that. Right? So there's all sorts of things that you have to be very cautious of in development, things that you might think would be self-evidently beneficial. Who wouldn't want to have this? Well, even in the case of a toilet, have other students do work on reading glasses. You would think, wow, putting on glasses would clear the world, enable you to see, and or hearing aids for people that are going deaf. You can fix that problem for $2, right? But even there, a lot of people just don't want those kinds of things, even when we might think that's actually what they should want, right? So. But yes, these big sanitation programs are receiving Bill Gates levels of financial support now as part of an otherwise very genuine and noble commitment to ensuring that the public health problems that Melinda mentioned, which can and should be consigned to history, are actually consigned to history.
Yes, penicillin and anesthesia, which makes all these medical things, and anything that stops global flu or epidemics.
Yeah.
How about those things?
Yeah, those are all sort of, there were a number of secondary things in the public health basket that one could have listed, and you've listed two of those. See you later, Jerry. So in that particular space, yes, those things were really important, and because they are now able to be done cheaply with few complications and can be well understood and disseminated, they're kind of like vaccines, other things that are just clearly, take this tablet, put this injection into the baby's butt. All sorts of beautiful things can happen in the world now with seemingly very simple technical interventions that were just impossible for either because we didn't have them or we did, but they were just super expensive and just not able to be afforded by people that. So those kinds of things that you've mentioned are now ubiquitous. We should be able to do those kinds of things much more systematically than we do. Most of my actual work these days is really spent though looking at implementation systems on why so much of these things that should be relatively straightforward to deliver to people, and where it should be largely just a financial infusion that enables these things to be able to be widely available, turn out not to be. It had to be way more complicated than they often are. But in the public health space, I would certainly list those things that you mentioned. I was just trying to, for presentation purposes, diversify my portfolio.
Birth control?
You could. I think though that that comes much later in the development process, and development itself, if through education and through a whole bunch of other things, will get your birth rates down pretty fast. So the actual technology of birth control, the ubiquity of that, again, like I mentioned with other things earlier, that's happened sort of as a result of having wealth rather than sort of leading to wealth. But it can also work and very powerfully, interactively with development processes to really lower fertility levels in ways that we haven't seen before. Bangladesh, for example, and Iran, two very different countries. But they've been able to use their own sort of ways of addressing the family planning problem, ways that are for them consistent with Islamic theology. But those two countries have probably had the fastest birth reductions in human history. So those are good if you think that the population problem is the big one we need to be wrestling with. But from a development sort of broader perspective, most of the work of ensuring that people reduce their fertility happens as a result of development, and doesn't drive development. Yep.
Well, I have a question about the World Bank.
Sorry, just to wait for the microphone.
Debbie Quinman.
are those two institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, do they come under financing through the UN? Or how are they subject to UN governance? Or
Yep.
how does that work?
How does it work? Good question. Formally, they are part of the UN system. They are the international law that governs the United Nations, also in principle governs the way that the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank function, but they are, for all intents and purposes, separate organizations. I carry a diplomatic passport, for example, so to that extent, I'm part of the UN system, but we have our own administrative systems and all the rest of it. But where does our actual money come from? Two places. From there are, I think, 193 governments in the world, or countries in the world, out of the 205, depending on how you actually count countries, that are members of the World Bank Group. And those are divided into the donors to the World Bank and the recipients from the World Bank. And so there's usually about 40 countries or so that are Part 1 countries, as we call them, the ones that give annually out of their foreign aid budgets money to support the work of the World Bank. That money in turn then gets leveraged on global credit markets, and we use the credit ratings of the World Bank itself to be able to generate the sums of money that we then loan back to governments to be able to, for them to in turn to realise their development objectives. So it's sort of this combination of the money that's granted to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund by the rich countries of the world, and then using that pot of money to leverage additional resourcing through the global commercial credit markets. The slight exception to that is the IDA, is the International Development Association, is the grant money. That grant money is granted. Well, the World Bank is essentially the clearinghouse for the resourcing that's given to the World Bank expressly for the purpose of responding to the challenges of the lowest income countries of the world. And so that they're not getting loans, and that they need to pay that back. So there's no need for their resourcing to come from the international credit markets. That money comes exclusively from either the World Bank's accumulated resourcing or from the donations on a every 2-year basis given to the World Bank by the rich countries of the world. But we are, and then in turn, just going by international law, we are run by the board of the World Bank is run by the donor governments of the world, most of whom are democratic countries, and so they are there to exercise their due diligence as democratic countries, as the providers of most of the resourcing for what the World Bank does.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I think we're done. Very good. Thank you.